It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here today to this conference on life and death in early modern philosophy. And in spite of the solemnity of the theme, I'm sure we're going to have an entertaining time. The conference, as you know, is a joint venture between two societies, the European Society for Early Modern Philosophy and the British Society for the History of Philosophy. It's the first time the societies have worked together, and I hope, Brexit or not, that it'll be the first of many. So I'd like to thank the boards of both societies for agreeing to this arrangement and making it possible for us to hold a conference on this scale. We're also deeply indebted to four further sponsors: to KCL for enabling us to hold this opening session in this splendid hall here, to the Philosophy Department of Birkbeck College, to the Birkbeck Institute of the Humanities, and to the Wellcome Foundation. As some of you know, the Wellcome Foundation is encouraging us to treat this occasion as a moment to initiate further collective research plans, and we'll be talking about that a little bit during the next couple of days. Now, as well as these institutions, which have played an essential part, I'd like to thank a number of individuals who have made the conference possible. I'm especially grateful to Professor Maria Rosa Antoniazza of KCL and to Professor Halvard Lillehammer at Birkbeck for their support, to Laurencia Sanz, who designed the handsome poster that you can see on the screen, to Emanuele Costa, Eva Lauenstein and Beth Hodgett, who will be here to help you with anything you need, or most things you need, I think, over the next 2 or 3 days. But most of all, I want to thank Dr. Charlotte Knowles. Many of you will know Charlotte already from her emails. Charlotte is an extremely talented philosopher, but she's also an amazing organizer, and her help has been absolutely invaluable. Before I turn to philosophical matters, one practical point, or practically two practical points. Tomorrow and on Saturday, the conference will be held in a different venue at Birkbeck College. Birkbeck College is in Torrington Square. The exact address is on your conference program, and a map's included at the back of the conference pack. But if by any chance you're in doubt and need help, then please just ask us. Tomorrow the day will begin at 9:30 with Professor Ursula Renz's plenary lecture. One more practical thing: the British Society of the History of Philosophy has asked me to remind you that immediately after this session at 6:15, they're having their annual general meeting. This will be in room K019, which is sort of go out of the door and turn left along the corridor and on the right. And of course, you are all welcome to attend. The title of our conference, Life and Death in Early Modern Philosophy, raises at least two sets of questions, I think. Some of them belong to metaphysics and natural philosophy. For instance, what is it to be a living thing? Are stones or tables alive? And again, what's dying? Is it a process of total destruction, or is it some kind of transformation? Other questions belong more clearly to ethics, medicine, and theology. For example, what constitutes a physically and psychically healthy life? And do we have to worry about the hereafter? When we chose this theme, one of our hopes was that the conference would enrich our sense of some of the connections between these two sets of questions. This is a complicated issue, as you know, partly because early modern philosophy is so extremely eclectic. It draws on a broad range of classical and religious traditions, and it blends them into a series of more or less syncretic positions. Early modern philosophers articulate an exhilaratingly broad range of views about the nature of life and death, And these in turn give rise to diverse and sometimes competing accounts of what's involved in leading a good life. Over the next few days, I'm sure we'll examine and reflect on some of these positions, but the eclecticism that produces such a rich array of philosophical stances isn't, of course, confined to philosophy. On the contrary, it saturates the whole of early modern culture. When we study the philosophy of this period, it's helpful, I think, to keep this broader context in mind and to suggest, extremely sketchily, how this might be so. I'd like to talk briefly today about a figure who is, in a sense, a leading 17th century philosopher, although we usually think of him as a painter. And the person I have in mind is Nicola Brewster. During his lifetime, Poussin was regarded as something of an intellectual. For example, Bellori, one of his earliest biographers, comments on his erudition in the liberal arts and philosophy, and both in Rome and in Paris, the two cities where he lived and worked, he was connected to learned circles. In Rome, one of his major patrons was Castiano del Pozzo, who was the secretary to the Cardinal Francesco Barberini, himself a great collector and antiquarian. And partly through that connection, Poussin became part of a Parisian intellectual circle, which included, for example, the book collector and librarian Gabriel Naudet and Pierre Gassendi. There's a record of a meeting where Poussin was just about to leave Paris for Rome, and Gassendi was among the people who came to say goodbye to him. Now, art historians have made a great deal of Poussin's neo-Stoicism, and I think this is indeed a significant strand within his work. But it's important not to let it obscure the role of other traditions, including a more Epicurean outlook, which seems to me to be important, and of course a Christian one. All these traditions shape the way that Poussin portrays the relationship between life and death, and by juxtaposing them, he is able to present this relationship as unavoidably multifaceted. Now we can begin to see this complexity in a trio of paintings where death is represented as more important for those who remain alive than for the person who actually dies. Dying is absorbed, as it were, into a range of intersecting social practices, and it becomes a part of life. So here, for example, is the Testament of Eudamidas, painted between 1644 and 48, and now in the Danish National Gallery. The dying Eudamidas is dictating his will, in which he asks a friend to take care of his mother and daughter, who you see on the right. We see him as he struggles to complete this task, but his face is somewhat in shadow, and our interest in him is almost eclipsed, I think, by the other figures in the painting. The doctor who feels for his heartbeat, the scribe whose yellow garment catches the light, and the grieving mother and daughter at the foot of the bed. Dying, it seems, is about medicine and the law and the grief and anxiety of the living. Maybe an even more striking exploration of this idea comes in the portrayal of extreme unction, which is one of the first set of 7 sacraments that Poussin painted for Del Pozzo. This time, and here it is, this time the dying man is merely the object of everything that's going on. He lies there inert, but the priest in the yellow robe anoints his eyes, and the man in the red stands by with a candle. Between them, and sort of interrupting the religious ceremony, is a scribe who has perhaps been taking down the man's will. On the right, there are people busy with food and medicine. At the foot of the bed, we find, as before, a woman overcome by grief. So religion, law, grieving, and medicine are all active and busy in this almost bustling deathbed scene. And the woman with the baby on the far left also reminds us of the way that death alters relationships and responsibilities within a family. So dying, as we see it here, is a social process involving many practices and participants, so that once again, death is absorbed into life. Now, I'm not sure if you'll agree, but I think one could almost say the same about this lamentation from 1657, which is now in the National Gallery of Ireland. The dead Christ lying along the bottom edge of the picture seems almost incidental to the expressive grieving of the living. They, I think, are what really hold our attention. Now, you may be thinking that a different kind of intermingling of life and death is suggested in Poussin's celebrated pictures of the Arcadian shepherds. There are two versions of this scene, one from 1627, which is now in Chatsworth House, and the much more famous one from the Louvre, which was painted 10 years later. Now, in the first of these paintings, we see a shepherd tracing out the letters of an inscription on a tomb. And in the second, Poussin shows us the same moment, though this time the inscription is much more prominent, and the shepherd's shadow falls clearly across the front of the monument. In each of these paintings, as you know, the inscription reads, "Et in Arcadia ego." And in both, the implication is that the shepherds can't understand these words. There's been a lot of debate among art historians about how to interpret this phrase, "Et in Arcadia ego," which is taken from Virgil's Eclogues. According to one of Poussin's earliest biographers, André Philippien, the ego in question is the person buried in the tomb, and the inscription means, "I lived in Arcadia." But other interpreters, from Panofsky onwards, have suggested that the I refers to death. I, death, am here, even in Arcadia. On this reading, what the shepherds struggle to make sense of is the presence of death in the midst of even the most harmonious and untroubled forms of existence. There's nothing alarming about death. On the contrary, it seems to be a subject of wonder. But nonetheless, symbolized by the stone tomb, death is as solid a presence as anything in this tranquil and rather dreamy landscape. Now, so far, the paintings that I've touched on distance us from death, whether by making it a social process or by representing it as something unknown. Death, Poussin seems to be insisting, is continuous with and part of life. But he also acknowledges the tension between this somewhat stoic or Epicurean attitude and the experience of death. And it's here, I think, that we come to some of his most philosophically suggestive works. So let me just briefly talk about one more pair of pictures. Now, just a short walk from here, in the National Gallery, is Landscape with Man Killed by a Snake, probably painted in 1648. When you first look at this large canvas, you see a calm landscape with some shaded grassy banks in the foreground, water, a track running in from the right, and a sunlit town in the distance. But as you look more carefully, you notice a small male figure who is running full tilt along the water's edge. Have you got it? Yes. And as you look again, though it's difficult to see this both in the painting and on this slide, in the bottom left-hand corner, you see a dead body strangled by an enormous snake. I think there's something almost fantastical about this snake with its great black gleaming coils. There's also no mistaking the fear on the face of the running man who's suddenly come upon a horrifying death. In his face and posture, we really see the terror of death. But at the same time, this death occurs almost unnoticed and out of sight, and it doesn't really disturb the landscape at all. The woman in the middle seems not quite to know what's going on. She's sort of raising her hands at the man and saying, what's wrong with you? What's up with it? And although this is hard to see, in the center of the picture, sort of further back, there's a group of people who are just continuing to chat as though nothing has happened. So death is both a very daunting reality and an insignificant, almost invisible event. Now, to this classical opposition, Poussin also adds a Christian dimension, both in the snake, after all a familiar symbol of evil, and, if you can see this, in the fisherman whose boat is just visible behind the running man. These fishers of men are drawing up their nets, but they remind the viewer of the redemption promised in the New Testament, and thus of another reason to view death with tranquility. So there's a tension here, an individual terror of death, a Christian acceptance of it, and an indifference to death as an insignificant part of nature. Poussin also explores this same confluence in a less well-known painting, which is now in the Montreal Museum of Art, painted between 1637 and 1639, man being chased by a snake. This picture, by the way, formerly belonged to the British painter Duncan Grant, who sold it to the art historian and also well-known spy, Anthony Blunt, one of the great experts on Poussin of his age. Now here, as in the picture we've just been discussing, it takes a minute to see what's going on. That a man has just noticed that he's being chased by a small snake, which is right down here in the foreground left, and he started to run away from it. As his frightened face indicates, he knows that he is about to die. And in case you should be in any doubt of that, Poussin has put a large, tall, dead tree right in the middle of the scene. Now this time then, we observe someone immediately confronting death. Not anyone else's death, but his own. Once again, though, he is a very small figure in a tall, indifferent landscape of river, hills, and sky. And I'm sorry to say I've had to crop the picture, which is actually taller than the detail you see here. Once again, also, we see immediately behind the running man a fisherman who is raising his white arm. Maybe he's casting his line, maybe he's hooking a fish, a fisher of men. We don't know. Now, in these pictures, Poussin is free from the urge to create consistency that both inspires and bedevils philosophy. He doesn't have to reconcile these three aspects of the relationship between life and death to which he's been directing our attention. He can simply leave them to resonate. So perhaps they can also resonate with us over the next 2 days. Thank you. So that's as much as I'm going to say by way of introduction. I'm going to hand over now to Catherine Wilson, who will chair the first of our plenary lectures and introduce Michael Moriarty. But let me end by welcoming you once again. I hope you'll have a stimulating and a very puzzling time. And please welcome our first speaker now, Michael Moriarty.
Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Michael Moriarty, who's going to give us the opening plenary lecture. Professor Moriarty, Professor of French, University of Cambridge, a post to which he returned after a time at Queen Mary College in London. He's a fellow of Peterhouse and of the British Academy, and a Chevalier of the Ordre des Palmes Académiques, and one of a small number of foreigners, as I understand it, to have received that honor. Professor Moriarty specializes in early modern French thought, and the theme of several of his books, he has also, I should mention, translated Descartes' Meditations for the Oxford World Classic series, but his main work has been in trying to understand from different perspectives and taking on different themes, sub-themes and topics, the way in which the Augustinian revival of the 17th and 18th century was both something old and something new. It was something old in that it recapitulated in some ways the old opposition between pagan morality and Christian morality. But in its later incarnation, it was in part a reaction to the revival of Stoic and Epicurean ideas of pagan virtue as completely sufficient. And in the work of Descartes, Malebranche, Pascal, and then La Rochefoucauld, you see a questioning of that stance. The way in which it was new, though, was that it reflected two of the important developments of the 17th and 18th century natural philosophy. One was, of course, the advances in physiology and anatomy that led to a new understanding of mind-body relations and the intimate connection between mind and body. This could be seen as an impediment to virtue, as frustrating people's attempts to live good and orderly lives, and as accounting for the mediocrity and fallen state of the human being. And the innovation that followed on that quite quickly was the kind of invention of anthropology and social science, the beginning of systematic study of how people in the social world react to each other, what they offer, what they take, their gratitude and resentment, and generally how morality is influenced by these one-on-one interactions that people have. So in 3 books, he has explored these topics, as I mentioned, from a variety of standpoints. One is early modern French thought, The Age of Suspicion, Descartes, Malebranche, and Pascal. And this was followed by Disguised Vices, Theories of Virtue in Early Modern Thought, and then Fallen Nature, Fallen Selves, their book in that series. These books have been described, I picked some random descriptors from reviews, as rich and illuminating works, as exhilarating and deeply learned, and as involving meticulous scholarship. So I'm certain we have a great deal to learn from this opening lecture, which will be on the thought of death changes all our ideas and condemns our plans. Professor Moriarty.
Well, so my title speaks of Christian philosophical perspectives, and the first term is important because many early modern Christians philosophized more or less independently of their Christian beliefs, quite apart from those who did not accept Christianity. Montaigne's chapter on philosophy as a preparation for death contains noble passages of Epicurean and Stoic inspiration, but none particularly indebted to Christian theism. In Book 2, Chapter 6, on practicing, he discusses death in the light of his own experience of being knocked unconscious in an accident, possibly put onto that track by a remark of Seneca's about the experience of fainting. Montaigne's own experience confirms him the idea that the dying may not be feeling the pain, but from their groans and movements we infer they are in. In Book 3, Chapter 9, on vanity, he expresses a preference for a gradual slipping into death, a molle et douce, soft and gentle way to die. In Chapter 12 of the same book, on physiognomy, He rejects the Stoic idea, which had earlier entertained, of mentally preparing oneself for death, and cites with approval the example of the peasants he knows, who think of death only when it's actually upon them. And for a philosophical expression of this attitude, he turns to the Socrates of the Apology. The term that informs his thinking about death is nature rather than God. In 3.9, he mentions with apparent approval the efforts that philosophy and religion produce, âpres exemplaires, harsh and exemplary. But although they're exemplary, he has no wish to imitate them. He prefers the approach of the courtiers, Petronius and Tigellinus, compelled by Nero to commit suicide, who kind of slotted their death into their usual hedonistic pastimes. One can hardly then call his approach a Christian one. How would an early modern Christian whose philosophy is Christian have approached the question of belief in an afterlife with rewards and punishments? For an example, we might turn to the work of Eustache de Saint-Paul, the scholastic philosopher whose textbook Descartes thought the best example of the genre. Eustache argues that although for Christians the scriptures, the decrees of church councils, and the authority of the fathers put the spirituality and immortality of the soul beyond all possible doubt, it's nonetheless worthwhile proving these doctrines by natural reasons in order to glorify the faith and subdue heretics and pagans. The first step then is to demonstrate the soul's spirituality, from which its immortality can be readily inferred. This he does by a syllogism. The nature of a thing corresponds to its operation. Operation follows from being, operatio sequitur esse. But the operations of the rational soul transcend the nature of body or matter. Therefore, the rational soul is not material and corporeal, but spiritual. The minor premise he proves in relation both to the intellect and to the will. The intellect perceives common natures, abstracted from particular matter, and then forms the concept of immaterial entities such as God. And it perceives such objects without any dimensions, shape, colour, or any other modification of corporeal matter. These concepts are not material, therefore they arise from an immaterial faculty and form, the rational soul. As to the will, for the sake purely of moral virtue, it can overcome and command the sensitive appetite. It can will freely and perform acts of virtue and religion. These acts are above sensation and appetite, and thus far above body and matter. Hence the will, and the soul of which it's a faculty, are of a different order from body and matter. They are immaterial and spiritual. But what is spiritual is immortal and incorruptible. Being independent of matter, it can subsist separately from matter. Not consisting of parts, it's not subject to dissolution or corruption. More briefly, he argues that the desire for immortality is naturally instilled in us, and so cannot be vain or futile. When the body ages, the soul does not. Reason grows stronger with age. Besides, the belief in immortality is common to all people, upheld by the wisest philosophers. So here we have a basket of philosophical arguments for the soul's immortality. And the main line of arguments familiar from Aquinas. And since he's writing a textbook, not a polemic, it's not surprising he doesn't identify particular adversaries, except by general terms, such as heretics and pagans. The next two writers I want to discuss do identify their targets. These writers are the Flemish Jesuit Leonardus Lessius, 1554 to 1623, and the French layman Jean de Sillon, writing a generation later, 1596 to 1667. They are both explicitly, for one thing, they're both explicitly countering the claim that immortality is a fictitious notion, propagated so as to uphold the social order. As Sillon puts it, un artifice de police pour tenir les peuples en bride par la crainte des peines de l'autre vie et par l'espoir de la récompense. And Lessius's subtitle says that he's writing adversus arteos et politicos. Okay. But since the claim that immortality is just a political fable depends on the presupposition that there is no immortality, the fundamental task of the two writers is to refute the assertion that the human soul perishes with the body. To judge by the lines of argument they're aiming to refute, their principal intellectual target is Paduan neo-Averroism. Sillon, however, picks out a particular social group, a further particular social group for criticism, namely courtiers, who think professed impiety a part of social refinement, an attitude Pascal was later to identify and berate. In both Lessius and Sion, the defence of immortality is preceded by, and largely based on, a defence of belief in God and his providence. The general strategy of the two works is the same. It's quite possible Sion had read Lessius. He certainly declares that he's not scrupled to use arguments already advanced by others, but that he has also contributed arguments of his own, and sometimes he criticises familiar arguments even while he rehearses them. Both of them emphasise the existential implications of the issue of immortality. Lessius says that if it were found that the soul is mortal in human beings, as it is in animals, there is nothing for us to fear for the future. But unconcerned as to what is to come, we shall be able to live as we please. But if the contrary is proved, we should well and truly be anxious lest after this life our immortal soul fall into severe and immortal punishment. Again, Sion observes that the knowledge of immortality is an essential part of self-knowledge, and he's using the very common use of self-knowledge in the early modern period, which focuses on generic species or species-wide rather than individual characteristic. Again, he stresses the existential, social and political implications, one of the chief heads of this knowledge, consists in a firm or presumptive judgment of the state of our souls after this life. On this depend both the government of our own behaviour and the establishment of the order and universal good of the world. The types of arguments, so their arguments for immortality depend on belief in God, and the types of arguments they use in favour of belief in God have implications for the way they handle the question of immortality. Lessius concentrates on the evidence of purpose in the order of the universe and in the structure of animals and plants, though he also cites miracles and prophecies. Sion methodically reviews all categories of beings, from prime matter, well, not exactly of being, all categories of existence, from prime matter to the angels, and concludes that none of them can be self-existent, and that all owe their being to a supreme intelligence. La même raison qui conclut qu'il y a beaucoup de choses qui ne tiennent pas leur être d'elles-mêmes, et par conséquent qu'il y en a une au-delà de toutes celles-là, qu'il est leur a communiqué, laquelle nous apprend Dieu. Ces mêmes raisons, dis-je, concluent que cette cause est intellectuelle et pleine d'une infinie sagesse. Okay, so we infer not just a God, but a wise God. And he uses, in fact, the celebrated analogy of the watch and the watchmaker. And he uses it to argue that whatever clearly acts for a purpose and is not itself rational, bespeaks the influence of a rational mind outside it that's formulated a purpose and designed the entity accordingly. So purpose is a key element of their argumentation. It's not all the argument depends on the notion of purpose. Both aim to show that although they share a generally Aristotelian conception of the soul, this does not imply that the soul is so completely dependent on the body for all its operations that if the organs of the body cease to function, the soul must infallibly perish. Lessius concedes that the intellect makes use of the imagination, which requires the animal spirits for its operation, and it requires also that the brain be fitly disposed. But the intellect's dependence on the body is not per se, but per accidens. Its prime function of judgment does not depend on the imagination. Its dependence on imagination results from its current function as the form of the body, but will cease once the soul's liberated from the body. So the soul as the form of the body is true only to a limited extent. It's not false, but it's not the truth. Sion inserts the argument for the human soul's immateriality into a more elaborate teleological schema. This is the advantage of showing both that animal souls perish when the body dies and that human souls do not. His point of departure is the axiom that God does not will that there should be anything in nature that is purposeless. He has therefore prescribed ends for all things for the sake of which they exist. If they cease to be able to fulfill those ends, he ceases to conserve them. But as long as they're capable of fulfilling them, he continues to preserve them. Now, to accomplish the operations, vegetative and sensitive, that pertain to their kind of soul, the brute beasts need the assistance of their bodily organs. And when the body ceases to be able to provide that assistance, the soul is unable to function. Its continued existence would therefore be pointless, and it is therefore annihilated. Now the same fate would befall the human soul, were it similarly dependent for all its operations on the bodily organs. But various arguments show this not to be the case, and the kind of arguments we found in Eustache and earlier in Aquinas. The soul's highest operations concern purely spiritual entities which can neither harm nor benefit the body. These rational operations are positively hampered by sensation and imagination. So if the soul can perform key operations like thinking and judging without input from the body, it can still fulfill its purposes when separate from the body, and God will therefore preserve it in being. So the definition of the soul as the form of the body does not exhaust its nature. It is more than the form of the body insofar as it reasons and conceives intellectual attachments. So its relationship to functions that depend on the body can be explained by an analogy. Sion's analogy is that of a man shut up in a room who depends on the windows in order to see, and whose sight is affected by the state or colour of the glass. This dependence will cease if the glass is broken or he leaves the room. Likewise, in this life, the soul cannot perform the functions of its higher part if the senses and organs are disordered. But when liberated by death, it will be able to perform these operations, deriving from its essence, namely understanding and volition. Notions of purpose are even more essential to other arguments for immortality. Lessius argues that the world was made for human beings. It is our spacious and well-furnished home, and without human beings, all its beauty, order, and variety would be in vain. But since all things were destined for man, he must himself have a higher destiny beyond these things. The entire order of nature and its workings would be out of proportion if we are to pass only a short and unhappy time on this earth and then revert to nothingness. Secondly, all things tend towards perfection and attain that perfection of which they're capable. But human beings can't attain the perfection of wisdom and virtue in this life. And if there's no afterlife in which they can do so, nature, which otherwise does nothing in vain, same maxim again, has given them their capacities and their desire to fulfill them to no purpose. The soul's self-knowledge in this life is very obscure, as witness all the disagreements about it among philosophers. And again, self-knowledge means sort of generic self-knowledge, not one's knowledge of one's own personal nature. The soul could therefore never know itself if it were to perish with the body. But once released, it will have a clear and distinct vision of itself and of spiritual realities. Thirdly, God's goal in creation could be only the manifestation of his perfections. But if humans are mortal, the world would not display his wisdom, goodness, and providence. Would it be wise to create an eternal universe, the Lord of which is mortal? Would it be good to enable everything else to attain its perfection, while man is unable to attain the 100th part of the good of which he is capable? Would providence abandon the soul to its own lusts, without incentives for virtue and deterrents for vice, leaving crimes unpunished and good without reward in a world where the wicked dominate and oppress the good? Much bitterness is linked with the sweetness of life, says Lessius, so much that life as a whole seems bearable only if there is hope of a future sweetness. It's not surprising, he says, that the pagans, largely ignorant of retribution after death, accuse the gods of cruelty for allowing the good to suffer and the wicked to rule. In other words, from the perspective of this life, God's perfections are invisible rather than manifest. So the argument so far is taking the form almost of kind of criticism of God, unless, and this is the big unless, all these complaints fade away once we accept the soul's immortality along with reward and punishment after death. Sion's arguments follow a similar path and again require a notion of the divine purpose. As soon as we can use our reason, we desire to be happy. It's a natural instinct, as everyone agrees. And the philosophers see that God would not have implanted this desire in humanity if it could not be satisfied, for he does nothing in vain. But all appetites tend towards the rest produced by complete satisfaction. Yet satisfaction of this desire is impossible in this life. It must therefore come after death. But if the soul can be happy after death, it can exist without the body. and separation is not tantamount to annihilation. Moreover, if we compare our condition with that of the animals, we can see that God's goodness would be radically incompatible with the annihilation of the human soul at death. Echoing Lessius's remark about the pagan sense of the God's cruelty, Sion asserts that if this life were all, it could be the gift only of malignity. It's almost a kind of Schopenhauerian kind of gloom here. The most pleasurable existence would be blighted by the prospect of annihilation. But pleasure is rarely the lot of human beings. Sion methodically lists and eloquently denounces the evils of human life, from which the animals are exempt. They need not work to survive. They're blessed with good health. They have the pleasure of sex without shame or disease. They're not tormented by the passions or by the tyrannous and false ideal of honour. We, on the other hand, are ravaged by illnesses, but the remedies are just as bad as the illness, as many die from medical treatment as are saved by it. We alone, among the animal creation, not only kill fellow members of our species, but glory in doing so. Yes, but, says the objector, we have some advantages the beasts do not have. We have society. But, Sion replies, even the best form of government, monarchy, Sion was a protege of Richelieu's, by the way, so he's going to say monarchy is the best form of government. It's flawed, and it can degenerate into tyranny. The administration of justice involves punishment much more than reward. The rewards society offers are imaginary, as in the case of glory, or real but harmful to others, as in the case of wealth. Property is one of the main sources of evil, and the legal system often simply reinforces the evil instead of removing it. Not only then are the beasts better off than man. If death means annihilation, it would be better if mankind had never existed. Why should God have made the world as a palace for man if the occupant is condemned to a short and miserable life? How could his wisdom grant the beasts a happier life than that of their king and master? One of the signs of God's purpose is apparent in the attachment of pleasure to acts that are necessary for the preservation of individuals and of the species. But the higher operations of the mind, points out Sion, have no such attractions. We experience the pain of war within ourselves, the struggle between the passions and reason. We could never endure it without thought of a reward in the afterlife. The intrinsic quality of virtue is not enough to counterbalance its difficulty and the attractions of pleasure. Honour and glory are rewards available to few. God has given us the love of truth and has prescribed the moral law so society can function peaceably. But if we were to discover that the truth is that there is no life after death, why should we not just pursue pleasure at the expense of virtue? There would be a strange disconnection between the dictates of truth and those of morality. For there's no advantage in pursuing virtue in this life when the virtuous are generally unfortunate and wealth, honour and pleasure are achieved by wickedness. If human beings are mortal, God's only reason to create must have been his own glory. He doesn't need anything outside himself. But if human beings are mortal, they can have no reason to glorify God, but every reason to think him a God without goodness, wisdom or justice. So the argument for immortality then, as I say, depends on this rather negative account, pessimistic account of the status quo and its apparent injustice. But what happens if the sense of purpose on which Lessius and Sion rely in their argumentation, what happens if that disappears from one's understanding of the cosmos? What happens when we cease to interpret the workings of the physical universe in terms of the ends fulfilled by inanimate objects? The question is most obviously raised by the natural philosophy of Descartes, or equally you could say Hobbes or Spinoza, but for my purpose Descartes. It is true that Descartes does not say, although the image of the tree of knowledge has la morale as one of the higher branches and physics as the trunk, he doesn't argue that the content of ethics is dictated by physics. The two perspectives are independently valid and complementary. So when Descartes says, asks whether we should seek for final causes in nature, he links it to the question whether the world's been created for our sake. And scientifically speaking, we shouldn't look for final causes in nature, and no, the world hasn't been created for our sake, okay? In ethics, he says, however, it is a good thing to think that it has been made for our sake, because it encourages us to love God. Okay. And there is one case where God's purposes, so there is a sort of disconnection between ethics and physics here, but you can't solve ethical problems by invoking physical principles. Okay. So Descartes can argue that his anti-finalism doesn't have bad ethical consequences. But there is one case, indeed, in which purposive activity is manifest, and that's the creation of the human being as a compound of soul and body. From a mechanical point of view, we can understand the process of sensation in its physical aspects in terms of the stimulation of nerve filaments connecting the sense organs to the brain, from which the soul accesses them. But we shan't understand the process fully if we don't go further and conclude that the cerebral motions that deliver particular sensations to the mind do so in order to preserve us in being. The senses have been implanted in us by nature for this purpose, and thus assure us of God's power and goodness. Okay, so there's one area in which we can invoke divine purpose. The only divine purpose, however, we've been able to deduce from this is that God wills to preserve the union of soul and body, which of course is not a permanent state of affairs. So his philosophical approach rules out in advance arguments for the survival of the soul after death that depend, as in Lessius or Sion, on our discerning God's purpose from the order of the universe as a whole, and from the operations of creatures lower in the ontological hierarchy than man. If the thought that God created everything for human beings is an ethical conception, then however valid in that context, it cannot be used to establish a metaphysical thesis that the soul can survive death, since, as the tree metaphor shows, ethics is logically posterior to metaphysics. So the basis of the belief in immortality in Descartes must be narrower than in the other writers. Okay. It is nonetheless, he thinks, entirely solid, and it consists, of course, in a clear and distinct perception of the distinction between the soul and the body. So Descartes is not hampered, unlike his scholastic predecessors, by a conception of the soul as the form of the body, or as dependent for its operations on the input of the senses, because of course it works with innate ideas. Strictly speaking, as the second objections point out, the meditations do not demonstrate the soul's immortality. He refers, however, the objectors back to the synopsis for clarification. In the synopsis, he's explained that he's proved the real distinction of mind and body from the fact that they're clearly and distinctly conceived as different substances. Moreover, the soul, unlike the body, is indivisible, and this is sufficient to show that the dissolution of the one does not entail the death of the other, and that allows us to hope for another life. Immortality is thus credible. Okay. But we can't prove it true unless we establish that all created substance is intrinsically incorruptible, which would require an explanation of the whole of physics, okay, which falls outside the scope of the meditations. Okay. So he concedes to the objectors that he cannot prove that God has not decreed that the soul should perish when the body dies. Only revelation supplies this knowledge. Nonetheless, he can regard himself as having discredited the unbelievers' claims that the soul perishes with the body. And he regards his philosophy as offering reasons to hope for an afterlife, not certainty of it, reason to hope for it, that enable us better to cope with this one. So to Huygens, he writes, Huygens is grieving for the loss of his brother, and Descartes offers him a remedy that he finds effective, both against the pain of bereavement and the fear of one's own death. It consists in reflecting on the nature of our souls, which I think I know so clearly must outlast our bodies, he says, as well as a letter of consolation, and are born for kinds of pleasure and happiness far greater than those we enjoy in this world. But for those who die, I can conceive only that they pass over to a sweeter and more tranquil life than ours, and that we shall go to meet them one day, even with remembrance of the past, for I recognise in ourselves an intellectual memory which is assuredly independent of the body. So the hope of reunion with those we have loved is a significant factor, and we'll see this issue come back later on. Nonetheless, I mean, he says that although religion gives us all kinds of reasons to, has much to say about the afterlife, he finds the teachings of religion less powerful than what we learn from des raisons naturelles fortes évidentes. Okay. The prospect of life after death comes up frequently in the correspondence with Elizabeth, and as in the letter to Huygens, the discussion frequently has a therapeutic aim. The letter of 18th May 1645 is a response to the news of Elizabeth's illness, a slow fever which Descartes diagnoses as resulting from an underlying sadness. This can only be overcome if she learns to strengthen herself against misfortune. And Descartes' treatment for this is a kind of cognitive therapy, whereby the great souls can learn to master their passions. For on the one hand, they consider themselves as immortal and capable of experiencing the highest bliss, and then on the other hand, considering that they are joined to a mortal and fragile body, subject to many infirmities, and which must inevitably perish in a few years, they certainly do everything in their power to win the favour of fortune in this life, but nonetheless value it so little that they consider what results from it almost as what we as we consider the events of a play. Now, the satisfaction they gain from this way of thinking is this worldly and consists in the approval of their conscience. But he speaks of happiness after death in the letter of 1st of September 1645. For even without the teaching of faith, he says, mere natural philosophy gives our soul reason to hope for a better state after death than it's currently in. This hope is beneficial, as he explains in the next letter, where he discusses the knowledge that's most essential to a habit of good judgment. After the knowledge of God's existence, the second thing we need to know is the nature of our soul, inasmuch as it continues to exist without the body and is far more noble than the body and capable of enjoying an infinity of contentments that cannot be found in this life. For this prevents us from fearing death and so loosens our attachment to the things of this world, that we despise whatever is within the power of fortune. And Elizabeth herself emphatically endorses the prospect of a better life after death. If one is thoroughly convinced of the soul's immortality, it's impossible to doubt, she says, that it will be happier after separation from the body, which is the source of all the discomforts of life, as the soul is that of the greatest satisfactions. I do not in the least doubt that although life is not bad in itself, it should be abandoned for a condition we shall experience as better. That's from the letter of 28th October of that year. And Descartes' response seems to indicate a certain anxiety that her pessimism might lead to despise life excessively, perhaps with pernicious consequences for her health. He therefore emphasizes the uncertainty of the rational grounds for the hope of a better life after death. In her letter, Elizabeth has mentioned Canon Digby's speculations about the need, proved by reason for purgatory, not simply as a matter of Catholic doctrine. Well, she, as a Protestant, wouldn't accept purgatory anyway. So he knows less than Monsieur Digby, as he calls the canon. But setting aside what faith teaches us, I confess that with the aid of natural reason alone, we can make many conjectures in our favour and entertain great hopes, but can gain no certitude. And because the same natural reason also teaches us that we always have more good than evil in this life, and that we should not forfeit the certain for the sake of the uncertain, it seems to me to teach us that though we should not really fear death, we should never seek it either. So he's not accepting the sort of negative estimate of human life that we found in Lessius and Sillon. We can think that the good of this life outweighs the evil because on the one hand, we can set little store by whatever is outside us and does not therefore depend on our free will, the Epictetan distinction, as Charles Taylor calls it. And on the other, we can always turn whatever does depend on our will to good. He says that to Elizabeth in a letter of January 1646. Now, speaking as a philosopher then, Descartes does not speculate about the nature of post-mortem contentment, except as regards the hope of reunion mentioned in the letter to Huygens, quoted above. When he speaks of beatitude or supreme happiness, he often speaks of it as obtainable in this life and as within our control. When writing to Christina of Sweden about the notion of the sovereign good, he distinguishes an absolute sense of the term in which it can only apply only to God, and a sense relative to us, in which it refers to something that belongs to us in a sense, and which is such that to have it is for us perfection. The sovereign good consists in a firm and constant resolution to do the things that we judge to be best, and to employ all the powers of one's mind in knowing these things properly. So that's the equivalent to possession of virtue. So a certain kind of beatitude can be obtained in this life through the practice of virtue. So he doesn't follow Aquinas in arguing on metaphysical grounds that only God, as the universal good, can satisfy the human will, and that human beatitude can consist only in the division of the divine essence. On the other hand, he accepts that philosophy can illuminate the doctrine of the beatific vision, as appears from a letter to none other than Sillon. So Sillon's asked him about the beatific vision, and he says, you have yourself provided a very good answer, because Sillon did in fact discuss it in his own work, concerning the quality of the knowledge of God in the state of beatitude, when you distinguish it from the knowledge we have in this life, in that it will be intuitive. So we'll have an intuitive knowledge of God. We shan't have to deduce knowledge by a chain of reasoning. And again, he uses the same sort of rather Platonic language as Sillon. When the soul is detached from the body or united to a glorified body after the last judgment, when the soul and the body are reunited, who can doubt that it will be able to receive illuminations and direct knowledge of this kind? So, liberation from the body, direct knowledge. Okay. In a letter to Chanu of 15th of June 1646, Descartes explains that he feels he's made more progress in ethics than in medicine. Thus, instead of finding means of prolonging life, as he once hoped to do, remember the sixth part of the discourse, he's found a better way of dealing with death, which is not to fear it. And he explains in another letter how not to fear death. He discusses the possibility of a natural love of God. When we contemplate the power and majesty of God, the extent of his providence and the infallibility of his decrees, these thoughts produce a joy so extreme we feel we have lived long enough, since God has given us the grace to attain such knowledge. We've thus attained a natural love of God, a willed identification with him so perfect that we desire only that his will be done. Hence we no longer fear death, suffering or misfortune. This is a powerful expression of a kind of not exactly Christian Stoicism, but certainly a theistic, as distinct from a pantheistic variety. As he explains in the same letter to Chanu, the thought of the greatness of creation is an index, the indefiniteness of creation, is an index of the omnipotence of God, which is diminished by those who imagine the world as finite. It's well known that Pascal voices a very different reaction, whether his own or that of an imagined non-believer, to the idea of a world without limits. Le silence éternel de ces espaces infinis m'effraie. The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me. Unlike Lessius or Sillon, he does not see nature as furnishing proofs of the existence of God. He accepts the Cartesian split between an immaterial realm of souls and inanimate nature. A notion like horror vacui, nature abhors a vacuum, appears to him absurd. Inanimate bodies cannot have passions, fears, aversions, tendencies, aspirations, or inclinations. And though he doesn't explicitly say this, it is clear that he would have thought it absurd to say that they act for an end or that they seek perfection. So the human condition can't be illuminated by parallels with the physical universe. It can be illuminated by contrast with the physical universe, but not by analogies or parallels. Now, death is central to Pascal's philosophical anthropology. I'm not going to say a great deal about Pascal because we have a paper by Martin Pécharman to look forward to, in which he's one of the key figures. But there's just a few points I'd like to make here. Going back to Montaigne, Pascal condemns Montaigne's view of death as altogether pagan. He set no store, says Pascal, indignantly, by dying a Christian death. He thinks only of dying lâchement et mollement, in a sort of weak, cowardly sort of fashion. And he's picked these words from Montaigne's own sort of self-deprecating version of his own attitude to death in Book 3, Chapter 9. Secondly, Pascal aims to undermine the idea, which is common to most ancient schools of philosophy, that we have an overriding natural appetite to life. Any opinion, he says, can be preferable to life, the love of which appears so strong and so natural. The desire for glory in particular appears to be stronger. The sweetness of glory is so great that to whatever object we attach it, even death, we love it. And here's a sort of epigrammatic formulation: contradiction, contempt for our existence, dying for nothing, hatred of our existence. These considerations form part of a general strategy of evacuating the notion of human nature of any normative content. They're parallel to the reflections that tend to deconstruct the distinction between nature and custom. What are our natural principles, the principles to which we're accustomed? I'm greatly afraid that this nature is itself no more than a first custom, as custom is a second nature. But although we can't begin our understanding of human, we can't sort of say, well, let us, as an axiom, all human beings fear death. We can't begin with that as a sort of universal axiom from which we might possibly seek to draw conclusions if we didn't have a sort of Humean aversion to drawing conclusions from factual statements. The prospect of death is nonetheless a major driver of our activity. Being unable to cure death, wretchedness, and ignorance, human beings have come up with the idea of making themselves happy by not thinking about these things. And the strategy we adopt in order not to think about them is what Pascal calls divertissement, diversion, commitment to a short-term activity like dancing, or a permanent occupation like a military career that requires and absorbs all our attention. The paradox here is that we have to delude ourselves that we believe in the goal of the activity in order for the mechanism to function effectively. The gambler has to believe they want the money, they stand to win. The hunter, that it matters to catch the hare. Okay? So if you said, well, you have the money anyway, I'll give you the money now. Or, no, here's a hare. No, they wouldn't want them. Okay? So the very effectiveness of the mechanism is the reason why it's so pernicious. Now, Pascal believes that we have proof of the soul's immateriality. He puts forward a very abbreviated argument. We have arguments in favour of the soul's immateriality, let's say. He puts forward the very abbreviated argument that the awareness of pleasure, what is it that feels pleasure in us, he asks. It can't be found in any body part. Its locus must be immaterial. So he's arguing, in a sense, in consciousness. Sort of unified consciousness as distinct from a plural body. Secondly, he argues that self-reflexive action, as when a philosopher masters their passions, is impossible for a material entity. We saw that argument actually in Eustache. But he doesn't explicitly argue from immateriality to immortality. In fact, the very sketchiness of his arguments for the immateriality of the soul suggests that he's content merely to have cast doubt on the assumption that death is and must be the end of everything, in order to enforce the necessity of investigating whether there is an afterlife. And he wasn't original, as we've seen from Lessius and Sion, in pointing to the existential import of this question. It makes a difference to our whole life, he says, to know whether the soul is immortal. And the point's urged at more length in the following passage. The immortality of the soul is a thing that makes such difference to us, that affects us so profoundly, that only someone entirely devoid of awareness cannot care what the truth of the matter is. All our actions and our thoughts must follow such different paths, depending on whether or not there is hope of eternal happiness, that it's impossible to make a single move with good sense and judgment if we do not regulate it in accordance with our view of the issue. He insists that his appeal here is directed purely at rational self-interest, un principe d'intérêt humain et un intérêt d'amour propre. Okay, this is not an appeal to your religious stirrings of religious feeling, it's an appeal brutally to your self-interest. So you've got to investigate the question of immortality. But this doesn't involve weighing the kinds of arguments we've encountered already in Sion or Lessius or Descartes. It means, on the one hand, setting out the various possibilities between which we have to choose. What happens if there is nothing after death? What happens if there's life after death? What might life after death mean? And B, investigating the specific truth claims of Christianity, which is not purely a philosophical task, as it has an historical dimension as well. But I won't go further along that path. I'm content to point out the singularity of Pascal's own approach. I move on now to another Augustinian thinker, and I'll be talking about him for the rest of the paper. An Augustinian thinker, nonetheless, of a very different stamp from Pascal, namely Malebranche, who furnished me with the title of this paper. And Malebranche is a fascinating figure for many reasons. He doesn't quite fit in to Charles Taylor's celebrated narrative of the decline of the ontic logos in early modern philosophy. For he believes, Malebranche, that is, not Taylor, well, Taylor too, that our moral choices should be informed by a knowledge and love of the hierarchy of perfection or value instantiated in the order of the universe. Secondly, however, he doesn't interpret this hierarchy in terms of an obvious divine purpose visible in the structure of the universe as a whole, such as Lessius and Sion both argued for. As with Descartes, the only place where we can find evidence of purpose is in relation to human beings. And we can infer something of the purpose for human beings of the, from the objective hierarchy of perfections. So, but we can't interpret it, I'll come back to that in a minute, we can't interpret it from the order of the world as a whole, because the world has not really been created for our benefit. It's been created for God's glory. And it's been created in accordance with the simplest possible set of laws, les voies les plus simples, the simplest means, since to act in this way best befits God's wisdom. So God has not decided to send the rain where the rain is most useful to human beings. He's set up various laws of the communication of movements, which means that it's wetter in London than in Phoenix, Arizona. And this doesn't reflect any particular purpose for London, distinct from the purpose for Phoenix, Arizona. So God's purposes are only fully discoverable through revelation, although some purpose can be inferred from the objective hierarchy of perfections, which I'll say more about in a moment. But the third thing I want to say about Malebranche is that he uses some of his most distinctive philosophical positions to overcome the fear of death and to help us envisage what life after death might be like. The actual source of my title quotation is the preface to the 1696 edition of the Entretien sur la métaphysique et la religion, Conversations on Metaphysics and Religion, which was first published in 1688. In that 1696 edition, they were augmented by 3 Entretiens sur la mort, and these are the texts on which I'll concentrate particularly. And the work, as you may know, takes the form of a dialogue between the meditator, the meditatif Théodore, and the seeker, Ariste, who is more swayed by his imagination than his reason. He seems to be a kind of man of the world, a sort of recovering man of the world, who's sort of coming into contact with more solid spiritual values rather than superficial social chit-chat dominated by the seductions of the imagination. And they're later joined by another meditatif called Théotime, and the resemblance of his name to Théodore, of course they begin with Théo, is quite striking, but very obvious. All 3 then of these figures are involved in the dialogues on death. As Malebranche explains, the discussions of death invoke religious as well as philosophical principles. But it's usually clear which set of principles are being mobilized at a given point. He doesn't sort of filter out these things as methodically as a scholastic philosopher theologian would. Nonetheless, he does occasionally make it perfectly plain when he's arguing from scripture, as distinct from reason. In the preface, he ponders, like Pascal, the irrationality of the entrenched human attitude to the prospect of inevitable death. So this is where our title quotation comes from. La mort est inévitable. Elle rompt tous nos desseins. Elle doit donc changer aussi toutes nos vues. Death lifts the veil of sensible goods and brings us face to face with the authentic goods. The thought of death thus forces us to re-evaluate all our values, which is precisely why it's so unwelcome. The carnal and senseless man delights in illusion. If he sleeps a pleasant and agreeable sleep, if he has only pleasant dreams, then death, which delivers him from his stupor, is an unwelcome visitor. the sweetener of his sleep must be troubled by some terrible apparition if he is to awake with pleasure. So Malebranche is trying to wake us from the stupor, sort of lotus-like stupor of carnal contentment. But there is nonetheless a rational obligation to investigate. Even if we ignore what happens after death, we are rationally at fault. The slightest doubt concerning the eternity of our existence, from the context, I don't think this means a doubt that our existence is eternal. It means a doubt that our existence, or a doubt that our existence may in fact be eternal. Okay. You ask yourself, hang on, could there be life after death? And this is that kind of doubt or questioning. And this kind of doubt is sufficient for any reasonable man to suspend most of his projects until he's well and truly grasped the truth of the matter. However rebarbative the examination of this important question may appear, whoever leaves it to one side is insane. The stupidity of one whose investigations have led him to the wrong conclusions is less inexcusable than that of so many people whose choices in life are made irrespective of what follows. It's incompatible with the invincible appetite for happiness that Malebranche calls amour propre when he uses the word in a neutral sense. It's incompatible with his invincible appetite for happiness not to ask ourselves whether there is any possibility of life after death. And the reason why we behave in this irrational fashion, we don't ask ourselves the key question, is that we're overpowered by the senses, which lead us to relegate whatever transcends them to the level of the imaginary. This is rather similar to Descartes' account of the origin of prejudice, of course. Now, so we've got to ask ourselves, it's a matter of sheer rational self-interest, you've got to ask ourselves whether there can be a life after death. And he's going to follow a different path from Pascal because he's going to invoke philosophical arguments. We need, and here he is reverting to the Stoic attitude rejected by the later Montaigne, we need to reflect carefully and frequently on death in order to tame it. And one line of reflection we're invited to follow is to perceive death as a liberation from the ignoble subjection to the body, which is the most contemptible of substances, of the nobler part of ourselves, the soul. Death, the mind, the most noble of creatures, is separated from the body, the vilest of substances. So here's an example of moral consequences being drawn from metaphysical hierarchies of perception. The soul is intrinsically more perfect than the body, ergo we should welcome whatever the soul's dependence on the body is an aberration, and we should welcome its coming to an end. Now this rhetoric doesn't convince Ariste, and his response would have been applauded by Montaigne. I'm used to this slavery. I find it pretty bearable. I'm not like Théotime. I do not have a noble and lofty heart. I am content with my lot. So far from welcoming the prospect of death, therefore, he fears it. And it's this fear that the two meditators have to address. Now, they agree that there's an innate physical fear of death that we can't overcome. But there are also rational fears to be assuaged. We might fear death for two reasons. A, if it entails annihilation. B, if it means we may be worse off than we are now. We might not fear death, on the other hand, if we had A, certitude of survival, and B, certitude of being better off than we are now. If we don't have certitude of those things, we may still have good reason to hope for them. But if the best we have is hope, then supposing we're enjoying life on this earth, we might still fear death, because we should be losing a certain good for an uncertain, even if superior one. This is what Descartes pointed out to Elizabeth. If I'm afraid to die, says Ariste, this is because I know very well what I shall be leaving and do not know what I shall have. So let's go through these various possibilities. Death cannot, the meditators argue, entail annihilation. The soul's in a material substance independent of the body. It's not the form of the body. Substance cannot naturally go out of existence. And since the soul is not the form of the body and its function is not to preserve the body, there is no reason to suppose that God will annihilate it because it's become superfluous on the death of the body, an argument already used by Sillon. Moreover, in this world the most virtuous people are the most unhappy, apart from the foretaste of the future happiness which they hope. And this too confirms that there's an afterlife in which divine justice will be manifested and satisfied. For God to annihilate the noblest of his creatures would be incompatible with our idea of his wisdom and immutability. So his recycling arguments we've already encountered from pre-Cartesian philosophers. But if we're destined to survive death, that does not eliminate fear. First, death may be the gateway to eternal punishment. We can have no certitude of escaping hell. Secondly, supposing we do escape hell, we do not know what kind of reward we may receive. So this is an example of mixing philosophical and religious considerations, obviously. In particular, whether it would be preferable to a life of earthly pleasure. So the meditators have to establish either that earthly pleasures are unreal or unsatisfactory, or that we have good reason to hope for better pleasures in the afterlife, or both. They argue that God will not condemn those who have faith in Jesus Christ and who are imbued with charity. And we can be reasonably sure we have charity if our feeling of love of God, or love for God, is backed up by the reception of grace in the sacrament. So if we're Christians, we need not fear hell. Secondly, comes the pain of parting with earthly pleasure. Physical pleasures are inferior, they argue. They are fleeting, plagued by anxiety, followed by remorse. And again, they argue that the mind is nobler than the body and shouldn't be subject to it. Now, Ariste agrees with this in principle, but he replies that even if the pleasures we actually experience are unsatisfying, we do know what they're like. We can't conceive any kind of pleasure without the body, because the occasional cause of our sensations is traces on the brain, and we shan't have a brain. So Theodore and Théotime argue, A, our feelings don't all depend on the body. Our knowledge of our moral state may be a source of joy or sadness, and that's a non-physical emotion, like Descartes would call it, an intellectual emotion. And then they argue that separation from the body in death does not preclude bodily experience in the afterlife. And this is one of the most sort of difficult parts of the text. Death is not, after all, the separation of the soul from the body. And Ariste finds this a very odd idea. What is death but the separation of the soul from the body? So Théotime tries to make him see that death is not the separation of the soul from the body. He does this in a very odd way. He starts squeezing Ariste's arm till Ariste sort of cries out with pain. Okay? And the point is to get him, and Theodore actually says, stop, you're hurting him, as it were. It's quite a strange part of the text, but the point is to get Ariste to accept that pain is experienced as localized and as my pain. Okay? It's not just pain, it's I'm hurting, I'm in pain. But an amputee could likewise experience pain in an amputated arm. So for Théotime, who is never afraid of flouting common sense, the amputee's illusion is proof that we have a second set of limbs that, unlike the physical set, are incorruptible. It's in these limbs that amputees feel pain, but our own situation is in reality no different from theirs. Now, Ariste replies in apparently good Cartesian fashion, oh, hang on, what the amputee feels is a sensation of the soul, occasioned by a process in his brain, in accordance with the laws of body-soul union willed by God. Yes, says Théotime, that is what is happening. But it's not what the amputee feels, and it's not what you just felt when I twisted your arm. What they feel is a pain in their finger, just as Ariste felt a pain in his arm. Okay? So the finger in which they feel the pain, or the arm in which Ariste felt the pain, is not a material entity occupying extension. It exists in intelligible extension. What in God corresponds to physical space, what we perceive when we close our eyes, the kind of infinite space that extends before us. So although our soul is united to a physical body, the body we experience and through which we experience is a kind of ideal or intelligible double of the body, what we might call the body for consciousness. In other words, God could in principle enable us, even when separated from our physical body, to experience pleasant sensations. Of course, we were reunited with our physical body at the Last Judgment, but even before then we could still experience pleasant sensations. Now these would be inferior to the joy of union with God, but at least we shouldn't be losing physical sensations. So Arist's anxieties are unfounded, the fear of losing sensations. Our everyday experience of the world, or rather our interpretation of it, is challenged again in relation to a particular pleasure that Arist fears may be terminated by death, that of friendship. He asks how Théotime would feel about being separated from Théodore. See, this isn't a sort of physical friendship. So, you say, well, Théotime's reply is essentially that we have no more direct acquaintance with other people than we do with physical objects. I do not fear to say this in Théodore's presence. I love him only very imperfectly. How could I love him as much as he deserves to be loved when I do not know him and have never seen him? For what I see of Théodore is nothing but a certain arrangement of matter we call a face. But that is not Théodore. The argument's rather reminiscent of Pascal's argument on le moi. The Christian philosopher's love of his friend is based on moral qualities, love of truth, rationality, piety. But the qualities themselves and our perception of them is precarious. We may doubt whether the friendship is reciprocal. I do not know myself. How could I sound the heart of my dear friend? And this wonderful sort of self-distancing from the promptings of immediate experience. I can only discover if the Théodore I love is in my presence by the answers, his answers to my speech. And perhaps these are coming from a false Théodore who is imitating his voice. Okay? It's only in the afterlife that we shall see and rejoice in our friends as they are. Ah, Théodore, with what joy I shall embrace you when I see you in the full light of day, when I see clearly that it is you, when I shall know for certain that our friendship is reciprocal and that nothing will ever be able to break or weaken it. In the third entretien, they discuss the society of the future life, comparing it with the inadequate societies of this world. There can be no true society where there is no justice. Yet the best ruler in the world cannot render to each his or her due, for he cannot render someone happy who deserves to be so. But when Arist inveighs against the injustices of the world, he is reproved by Théodore, who insists that these injustices are subject to providence, and who qualifies an earlier statement of his own, imperfectly echoed by Arist when he says that in this world the virtuous people are the most unhappy. They would be so, says Théodore, but for the joy they feel in the firm hope of a future life. It's an allusion to 1 Corinthians 15:19, if in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are all men of miserable. This joy renders them happier, even in this life, than the wicked with all their pleasures. So Malebranche's rationalism is unhappy with the purely negative portrayal of human life on this earth, that the Lessius and Sion contributed so strongly to their offensive immortality. It's necessary to vindicate providence not only in the afterlife but in this life, even at the risk of inviting empirical refutation. It would be nice to think that the wicked do all feel remorse, but we may ask whether they do or not. Well, I won't follow our three discussants into their speculations on what the body will be like with which we're reunited after the last judgment. And I'll proceed to draw a few conclusions from what I've said up to now. We see that Lessius and Sion's argumentation, though especially in Sion's case straining at times against the Aristotelian framework, was still governed by the idea of purpose discernible at all levels of the universe. God and nature do nothing in vain, and the human, as we can see if we look at the whole of nature, and the human condition would be vain if we were not immortal. The soul does not perish with the body, for its rational operations exceed the capacity of mere matter. On this latter point, Descartes and Malebranche believe that they've only reinforced it by breaking with the Aristotelian concept of the soul. If their acknowledgement of purpose in the universe is more circumscribed than that of the earlier writers, since mechanics explains much that would once have been ascribed to final causality, they recognize that in certain areas we're entitled to discern the purposes of God. Descartes stands out from Lessius, Sion, and indeed Malebranche in his insistence that though we're indeed immortal, we can obtain a certain beatitude in this life. Though in the Principles he emphasizes the epistemological confusions that derive from the influence of the body over the soul, he does not regard this as ethically perverse, an ignoble servitude in the matter of Malebranche, clearly because his philosophical thought prescinds from the doctrine of original sin, so central to the 17th century Augustinian writers. Malebranche, on the contrary, seeks to highlight the unreality of earthly goods, even the intellectual ones, like friendship with a pious and intelligent fellow Christian, and to assuage our fear that in dying we lose the only goods we can conceive. Not content with asserting the happiness of the beatific vision, he investigates the possibility of post-mortem forms of experience, sensations and attachments that are in some sense continuous with those of this life, and that enhance earthly experience rather than utterly transcending it. But it's the other Augustinian writer, Pascal, who's the real outlier here, because he is the one who refuses to discern the signs of any divine purpose, either in the nature of human beings as they are, or in the physical universe they inhabit. Decision precedes understanding. Immortality is not a philosophical truth we can deduce. It's known only by our religious revelation. We must, by our own choice, either commit to or at our peril ignore. Thank you.